Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I drop my kid off at school and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Greetings, listeners. It's a brisk but lovely, very sunny February 22nd, and I'm happy to be talking to you as I walk home from dropping my kid off at school. I thought today I would do a couple quick takes. I've had some very enjoyable games in the last couple weeks that I may have mentioned here and there, but I don't know that I gave them the quick take treatment, and so I thought I would do so now. So the four games I wanted to talk about today, this is just sort of off-the-cuff commentary on new games I've played. The first one is New York 1901. Now, I got this in a trade with a friend. We had both brought games to the garage sale at my local game club, Toggle Gaming, and the game I brought was Steam Planet, which I always thought looked really fun, but I just never got around to trying it. And then he had brought New York 1901, which is a game that came out maybe 4 years ago, and people talked about it as a Ticket to Ride type game or level game in terms of difficulty. It has nice components, nice art. It got a lot of buzz for 5 minutes, and then I haven't heard much about it since. But I always thought it would be fun to play. And he had brought that, and it was literally the same thing. He had bought it a while ago, he'd never gotten around to playing it, decided he didn't have room on the shelf for it, was getting rid of it. And he thought my game looked cool, and I thought his game looked cool, so we just traded. So he took home Steam Planet, and I took home New York 1901. And I figured I would kill two birds with one stone from my shelf of opportunity by both getting rid of Steam Planet and playing New York 1901. Although I guess that's really just killing one bird, because the result of that is the same as if I had just played Steam Planet. So net neutral, I guess. Not as good as I would have liked, but nonetheless. So I got a chance to play a two-player game of New York 1901 with my neighbor, and that ended up being a pretty fun mix of elements. It's a tile placement game where you are building buildings in New York. You're buying land or occupying land and then building buildings, and you can tear down and build another building on top of a building you already have, as long as it's the next level up building. And I focused a lot on doing that, on trying to get as many of the top tier buildings out as I could, because the scoring mechanism is neat. You don't score for the buildings you have at the end, you score a building when you build it, which means that keeping a building on the board doesn't necessarily score you any points at the end, which is something I really liked as a mechanism. It means you could build a thing, and then immediately next turn you tear it down and build something else over it, and you score twice. That said, my neighbor won handily because I wasn't paying attention to the end game scoring at all. So there's two elements to this. There's the jockeying for land so that you have room to build your buildings and building expensive buildings. And then there's also the jockeying for the land along the streets that score. You pick 3 streets that score each round or each game, plus one other condition that's like how many buildings you have in different arrangements or something. And those scoring opportunities end up making up about a quarter of your points or more. And I did very poorly in all of those. I just wasn't paying attention to them. He said he wasn't either, but when you win all 4, maybe he was fibbing a little bit. I don't know. Anyway, it was a nice, light game. Definitely one to introduce to my family at some point, because it's not hard. We were able to learn it in about 5 minutes and play it in about half an hour for 2 players. So it definitely is that Ticket to Ride weight, with a nice, slightly different focus. So it'll stay in my collection for a while. That's New York 1901. First thoughts. Once again, if you haven't listened to the show before, sometimes I'll do these quick take episodes. I call them Shootin' from the Hip. I guess I didn't say that. Shootin' from the Hip. Meaning these are quick takes after 1 or 2 plays, not reasoned, thoughtful reviews of games. So take them for what they are. I might be totally wrong about a game. This is basically just first impressions of having played a game once. In part I do that, again, because I prefer not to do reviews on this channel, because part of why I do this channel is that I am a game designer as well as a game player, and I don't really like being in both the reviewing space and the designing space. It feels a little too much like all of the jaded old screenwriters whose job it is to read screenplays at movie production houses and spend their time critiquing scripts that other people wrote. So I don't want to spend too much time reviewing games per se. At some point in the future that may change, I guess, but for now. So anyway, that's what this episode is. The next game I'd like to talk about for a minute or two is League of Six. I believe that I talked about this already on the podcast. If not, apologies. If so, I apologize for redoing it. So League of Six is a Vladimir Suchy game, published by CGE in 2006. It is his first game. And it's a game about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I think, in the 14 to 1600s. So during that time, there were lots of wars, lots of soldiers roaming around causing trouble, and these 6 cities bonded together in a kind of commercial trade union to protect each other with soldiers and whatnot. Basically, that's the premise, but the idea is you are trying to get taxes for the king, raise money for the city fathers, and become famous for your ability to do those things. It's an interesting game. There's basically 3 different phases that involve different sorts of bidding on available resources and then spending those resources to get points. Ultimately, it's not very complex, so it's a nice middleweight game from a designer who otherwise makes very deep games. My first impression is that there's too much going on your first couple plays to really get a sense of how to win with regard to the cards. So you score points on 3 different ways. You score points by giving taxes to the king. You score points in placing these cubes all over this one placement board, and you score points by collecting these cards with figures on them, which at the end of the game will give you points based on which figures you have the most of. So if you have the most town elders, then you win the town elders thing and you get 9 points or whatever. If you have the most monks, you win the monks thing and you get 9 points there. And it's a sliding scale, so everybody gets a few points if you have at least one of them, and so on. It's an interesting little puzzle game. Probably not one I'm going to play a ton of times, but a fun game to break out now and again, and I think I'll look forward to it as the opening salvo of a Vladimir Suchy day, because it's relatively easy to play compared to some of the other games. Like teaching League of Six, not really a big deal. Teaching Pulsar 2849, or I imagine Underwater Cities, can't wait for that, much more of a deal. So that's League of Six, Vladimir Suchy game that I got to try, or Suchy, excuse me. The third game I wanted to talk about for a few minutes here is another one I got to try. And again, I'm not 100% sure whether I talked about it already on the podcast. If so, apologies. That's Comanauts. Comanauts is a new game from Jerry Hawthorne over at PUaD Games. People who made Mice and Mystics and Stuffed Fables. Those are other Jerry Hawthorne games. Hawthorne definitely has a knack for clever, story-driven games with beautiful art. Although he isn't the artist. I think he was the artist for the sculptures in Mice and Mystics. At least in the beginning. But he's got a knack for these kinds of story-driven games that are really focused on adventuring and exploring. And the Comanauts is the second game in this storybook series where they take a spiral-bound book that's got all the maps for the levels, and they use that as the base of the game, and then you flip from page to page, and each map has a different set of rules that come up. The mechanisms in Comanauts are very similar to the mechanisms in Stuffed Fables. So the players are drawing dice and then spending the dice to do actions, and the kind of dice you spend determine what kind of action you can do. So I mean, ultimately, Comanauts for me suffered from the same problem stuff Fable did, which is you have a turn where it's obvious you should move. The only thing your character needs to do is move, and all you do is draw attack dice. Well, actually, you can move with any die, but let's say you want to move an attack, and you only have a melee weapon. And then you draw 3 green dice, which are the attack dice, and 2 enemy dice. Well, now you can move, but you can't attack, and then the enemies activate. I mean, if the track is full or whatever. I mean, it's not that bad. It's pretty rare when you play that you just can't do anything, but you often end up getting rid of a die. And if you're excited for a game that has that kind of randomness in it, that's fine. But ultimately, not super satisfying. The art is great. The maps are neat. The story is interesting to a degree. We did not finish the first episode in the 3 hours we played. We got to the end of like the 3rd page, I think, and we said, okay, well, we got to take a break and we'll continue again later. So I think I'm going to go back next week and we'll play some more and try to finish the first scenario. I think I'm probably not going to be keen to play very many games out of this Comanauts. Although my buddy who has it, I think he will want to play more, so I might play more because he likes to, but wouldn't be my first choice. So that's Comanauts, Plaid Hat Games. Interesting storytelling, but the mechanisms, if you like stuffed fables, you probably would like this just fine. Although not for children the way Stuffed Fables was. My last Shootin' from the hip, I feel like this channel has been a little Martin Wallace saturated this week. My earlier episode being about the rulebook from this game, but I did get a chance to play a handful of stars, and I wanted to share some thoughts about that. First off, our regular listener Chris Hickman was one of the players. Hi, Chris. He mentioned that he thought, after having listened to the episode, he thought it was going to be a hard game to learn, and it wasn't. So that was good, that the work I did to prepare to teach it was not wasted. That said, there is a lot going on in the game, and it took a lot of work to get ready to teach it, which I would say is one of the downsides of any of the Martin Wallace Tree Frog games. I talked about that last week, though, so I won't go into it too much more. Having played now, some really interesting elements that this is definitely a game where your second or third play is going to be, with other people who are on their second or third play, is going to be far more interesting than your first play. I really liked the first play. The delicious choice of how are you going to use this card or this token. You can only use one of the resources on it. That is a great feature of Martin Wallace's deck building games. I really like the way the board works, the different aspects of travel, the randomized setup with the black holes, the way the setup works. You randomly distribute all the planets. Some of the planets get these little black hole markers on them, which then slide to a different spot on the board to one of their connections with the rest of the board based on the letter on the tile. And so each game you play, the board is going to look very different, which will determine all sorts of different dynamics. In ours, for instance, there was this kind of channel through the middle where there were like 4 planets that were all cut off from everything else around them except for entry points on either end of that channel. And so I got a card that let me make a black hole, and I cut off the endpoint on one of that channel. So then I had this sort of corridor where nobody could go to until we got the wormhole technology, which didn't really come out till the end. So it really made for an interesting dynamic that way. The different focuses that the races have is really interesting too. So different players were kind of focusing on different things. I do worry a little bit with experienced players that would lead to a little too much direction from the game, that you're forced to go in one way depending on the thing you have. But you still have a lot of resources, so even if you want to lean a different way, you can. And you can do a lot of different stuff with the cards that you have. I think probably, again, with experienced players, putting a little bit more drafting in at the beginning so there's less randomness would make sense. And I think that the don't discard the free play cards rule that I found on Board Game Geek is a good change, and I'm pleased that we used that change. So ultimately, it was fun. I played the explore modes who like to explore things and colonize, and I did that pretty well. It came in second. I would say my one real negative response on the first play is that it felt a little hard to know what you were going to be able to do in terms of getting a big turn going. Only having 2 actions per turn, it's really limiting, and the shuffle thing is a interesting impending clock. That said, the game took like 3 hours to play, which is longer than I would have liked, and frankly longer than I told the people who played, so I apologize for them. I think if you were playing with experienced players, it would be a 2-hour game, or with fewer players, it would go even faster. But overall, really fun, and worth checking out if you get a chance. That's A Handful of Stars from Martin Wallace and Tree Frog Games. Well, so that's 4 quick shooting from the hips games I've played this month that I hadn't ever played before. And I hope that you enjoyed the survey of them, even if some of it was a little repeat content. Apologies again, I forgot to check my notes before I left for my walk today. So, that's it for me. What new games have you played this month? Give me a shooting from the hip over in the Pick Up and Deliver Guild. I'm really enjoying the conversation we're having there. Hello to all the regulars and people who are posting in the guild. Love to see that. Let's keep it going. And I'd say if you know somebody who doesn't listen to the show yet and you can recommend it to them, it would be fun to continue to grow our listener base a little bit. We did tick up one subscriber in the Pick Up and Deliver Guild, so that's fun. If you're a listener and you haven't gone over and subscribed yet, that's a great way to do it. Go over and join the guild at Board Game Geek Guild 3269. All right, well, thanks for listening. I hope that you enjoyed the show, and I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.